Drew, it's such a pleasure to welcome you.
Pleasure to be here.
You have done amazing work in terms of equal rights, women's rights, an extreme lawyer. There's so much to learn and ask from you. So I'll, off the bat, let's talk about the hot topic and the hot button topic here in Silicon Valley lately has been, the sexual discrimination in Silicon Valley. And this is the admired place in the world for innovation, entrepreneurship, and the most innovative place in the world can go through this kind of crisis. So how would you address that?
Well, to me, the Silicon Valley still has a bit of a gunslinger quality to it. And I mean, obviously, certain companies that will go unnamed really see themselves as outlaws. But I think that long ago, most major American corporations outside of the Silicon Valley, the older ones, recognized that there were laws that applied to them as well as anyone else, and that the laws were there because stereotypical attitudes towards women, toward people of color, toward the LGBT community and other marginalized communities are sort of programmed in from the time we're born, whether you're a member of one of those groups or not. And so those laws that were passed in the 1960s and then later on amended were designed to make it so that in the business relationship you couldn't act on those kinds of prejudices. Now, it's been an imperfect world still, but with each new wave of innovation, you get a new wave of people, particularly very young people. The Silicon Valley is a much younger business group than you've seen before, and because of the acculturation of younger women to not, in fact, major in STEM subjects and to ultimately think about that as a career as much as young men have. It's been largely the province of very young, largely white and I guess Indian subcontinent and other a few other racial groups, but certainly not African Americans nor Mexican Americans, for example. So it's been the province of a very narrow group with a very narrow set of experiences and with an attitude that we are disruptors, that we are not part of the past, we're part of the future. But there is a lot to be said for some of the things of the past and the present, and that is laws and regulations and so on, and customs that in fact deal with the fact that left to your own devices, you tend to associate with people just like you, you tend to want to work with people just like you, and we know that the most efficient workplaces and the most innovative workplaces are those with diverse workforces. But it is very hard to get out of those habits, and I think that there are a number of ways of getting at it. Obviously, the law is one. I'm the chair of the Board of Equal Rights Advocates, which is an organization that gets hundreds, thousands of complaints about sexual harassment across the country. But certainly, the kinds of things that we see in the Silicon Valley are the more raw kind of grotesque sexism that you don't see as much these days in, say, a law firm. It used to be you could say, who's the sexual harasser in your law firm? Now it's a little more difficult. But in the Silicon Valley, it's who isn't. So, for example, there is going to be a new law being proposed by Senator Hannah Beth Jackson in the California legislature that specifically says you cannot harass if you are a venture capitalist or other investor vis-a-vis entrepreneurs who are seeking your resources. So there would be a specific law barring that, which there really isn't per se right now, although you could argue and extrapolate from others. But more important, I think, is for people to really sit back, and if you're a woman, to really group together with women, with people of color, and other groups that are not the in-groups in Silicon Valley, and to support each other to get themselves into positions of power and then use those positions of power to make changes. And there are good white men out there as well, there always have been, who who will help you. But I think that that until we get more women and people of color in the positions of power in the Silicon Valley, it's going to be harder to crack it.
Yeah.
But you know what, Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice O'Connor, used to say that Thurgood Marshall's value on the Supreme Court was not just that he voted based on his own experience, but that he brought to the other justices the kind of information and emotional intelligence and shared with them based on his background and brought to their attention things that they either didn't know or they did know and they really didn't want to think about it. And so the importance of having people like that who are different at the highest decision-making positions within the Silicon Valley, I think, will begin to create change, and having the bravery to do it as well. But I think that it's very important for these groups to work together, for women to work together, and to work with other groups that are just as talented as they are, as the people in the positions of power there, and to make a difference.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that. When you said other groups have to come into play, the most important group are the men who have not yet gotten into their own DNA, that, you know, women have to be given the opportunity and equal playing field. So in addition to the groups you mentioned, who's going to bring the big white elephant into the room and make it sit down and listen?
Well, I think, you know, I have to think of a lady like to put this, but you know, you get them by their pocketbooks and their hearts and minds will follow. Certainly, some of the major lawsuits in this country have made a real difference. Some of the men who have been called out recently in very high positions in the Silicon Valley, not the least of which is some of the very largest corporations in the Silicon Valley. You look at a thing like even Fox News, actually, which is not Silicon Valley, but Fox News has been forced to get rid of some of its biggest moneymakers, and it's having an impact on the bottom line. So I think, I don't know how, you know, you can do all the sensitivity training in the world, but until I think you have these men who are working side by side with women and others that they have excluded to this point, and see the extraordinary talent there, and that you know, Samuel Johnson was once asked, who's smarter, men or women? He said, well, which woman and which man? And I think that when there's just one, then they say, oh, well, that doesn't work. We're not going to hire any more like that. Of course, they never say that when a white man screws up. They don't say, well, I guess we won't hire any more white men. But I mean, you do have to have a kind of a critical mass. And I think the law is going to be very important, actually. And I don't mean that just because I don't say that just because I'm a lawyer. But I do think that you have to have mechanisms that hold people accountable. I think training is extremely important, but I don't think they're going to pay any attention to that training unless you have people at the heads of these corporations that say, if you don't have people at the highest levels, then I'm going to dock your salary. Now you can go the other way in the carrot and say, if you do, then I'm going to pay you a great deal more. You can have various incentives and disincentives that make it so that people overcome their absolute rigidity about spending any time or trusting anyone who doesn't look precisely like themselves. But you know, and sensitivity training is important. Implicit bias training is extremely important just for people, all people, to realize that they carry around these terrible preconceptions. But, you know, I was talking to the managing partner of a very fancy large law firm, the international law firm, and I said, well, do you do implicit bias training? He says, yes, we do. And I said, do you think it has any impact? He said, well, he says, maybe at the edges. He says, but I got to say, he says, you know, we don't have to worry about implicit bias so much here at the firm because we have so much explicit bias here at the firm. And I think that one thing about the Silicon Valley is you don't need a lot of implicit bias training. You got a lot of explicit bias to deal with. And I think that that their hearts and minds will start to follow when they are forced to deal with the legal ramifications of continuing to discriminate, but also when they begin to see that, I mean, there's already evidence that shows that something like, you know, that companies that are more diverse at the top in the Silicon Valley earn something like 5.4% more than less diverse companies. And then, you see what happens in a company like Uber, where you have, Mr. Disruptor himself, who had no respect for the law, basically. And it has and of course has created an environment that is very, very sexist among many of its other problems. So I think that kind of outlaw mentality, which is, on the one hand, can make for some breakthroughs, but on the other hand, is a form of immaturity, or can be a form of immaturity that is very, very destructive in a business and can actually bring a business down. And so I think it's the real life profit motive, the real life legal motives, as well as the people within groups, the women themselves and people of color themselves, really supporting each other and really banding together to help each other get into those positions, the same way immigrant groups have done in this country since time out of mind. And when I graduated from Yale Law School in 1971, and it was a relatively very small group of women lawyers in San Francisco at the time. And we just helped each other out. We took over the ACLU, we took over the Bar Association. We really, because of a multi-generational cadre of us, we really started to transform the legal profession. Now, that is an incomplete revolution, let me just say, because law firms at the top are still incredibly undiverse. But I think that to the extent that there has been any success, it has come from both sides. People at the top, white men almost always, saying this is the way it's going to be because it has to come from the top, but also people from the bottom getting together with women who have made it further up and pulling each other up to positions where they can make a difference.
Right. It's a pleasure. Thank you for all the advice and the wisdom. Appreciate that so much.
My pleasure.